Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Welcome to everyone joining us today online for the ASRI Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Taylor Zavitz, and I'm an ASRI scholar and sessional instructor and PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Victoria. The Animals in Society Research Initiative, for those of you who are maybe new to us, is an interdisciplinary research hub at the University of Victoria for all research that promotes critical thinking on human, animal, and interspecies relations. For information on other lectures in this year's series, you can visit our website, and Holly is posting the link on the chat now for you, so you have that, as well as an email address for ASRI if you'd like to join our listserv and stay up to date with monthly emails on all news and events related to critical animal studies. We acknowledge the generous funding by the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for this lecture series. Thanks also to our co-presenters at the University of Victoria for this lecture, the Indigenous Law Research Unit, the Departments of Philosophy and Political Science, the Center for Global Studies, and the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. We are welcoming a wide range of participants to today's lecture from 13 different countries. Thank you for joining us from all of your different time zones. So today we welcome Dr. James Tully, presenting under the title Animals as Citizens of Gaia Democracy. Dr. Tully is UVic Emeritus Distinguished Professor in Political Science and Law. He held positions in political science, law, and philosophy at McGill University and University of Toronto over many years. His research is on the relationships between law and governance. Of his many publications, the most recent is Democratic Multiplicity, Perceiving, Enacting, and Integrating Democratic Diversity. We will have time following the presentation for a question and answer period, so please just post your questions in the chat and I will order those and read them out at the end of the talk. So with our warm welcome to you, I will now turn the mic over to you, Dr. Tully.
Well, thank you all, Holly and Taylor and Manisha, for inviting me to this distinguished series. It's a great honor to speak in it as the third speaker this time around. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion because I'm sure the people who are listening are coming at this same question that I'm trying to address here, or at least investigate a little bit from very different perspectives. And as some of you will know, that's what I like the most, is discussions from people coming at these really difficult issues from different pathways. And so if it's all right, I'll just start and I'll give my lecture. I think it should be about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we can have a robust discussion period. Okay, so here we go. So this lecture explores the turn or the transformation to the ways that biodiverse life animates and co-sustains life over 4 billion years as our guiding light for co-sustainable human governance within what we call Gaia democracy. The complementary turn in law is from seeing law as a human-imposed order by states or global legal orders to planetary multi-species constitutionalism. So this is the view that the way biodiverse planetary life sustains life constitutes itself a complex constitutive order that humans need to learn how to redesign their own legal orders in accordance with if we are to recover from the 6th mass extinction and what could be the 22nd collapse of anthropocentric civilizations. So there's a large body of research on this at two ends of the spectrum. At one end, very high-level systems theory at the planetary level, and then at the other end of the spectrum, very close Earth pedagogy at the ecosocial level in local bioregions. And the great thing about UVic, and especially UVic law, is that it's at the leading edge of this kind of dual movement, which I'm really honored to be a small part of it. So I want to begin by drawing on two themes that I see in Manisha Dekka's very rich work. It has many themes, but I just picked out two of them today. The first is her thesis that the common law, at least as it's presently interpreted, misrecognizes the beingness of animals. She argues that it misrecognizes animals because it's anthropocentric. The law tends to see them in terms of property and personhood and in terms of rights. So if we move around and try to see animals from an anti-anthropocentric perspective and towards the perspectives of various kinds of animals, three familiar central features of their beingness come into view. These three features, as Manisha explains them, are embodiment, relationality, and vulnerability. She argues that the mode of being of animals is basically being with, mit sein, German. In addition, not only is it being primarily being with others, it's also oriented to care of oneself and relational others. So a fourth feature follows that unites this embodied, relational, and vulnerable mode of being in the world with others. It's an orientation, or what she calls an ethos, of responsibility, openness, responsiveness, and especially reciprocity to one's interdependent relatives. In the life sciences, this ethos, or nomos, if you're in a law school, is simply called symbiosis, that is, living co-sustainably within the Earth's biodiverse networks. Thus, I'll call this Manisha's ethos or ethic a symbiotic ethos. It's as diverse in its modes of enactment as the Earth's biodiversity. And it's really the main theme of the lecture. So the question then is, how would a legal system recognize the beingness of animals, given this understanding of their embodied, interdependent, vulnerable, and diverse way of beings? To answer this question, Manisha turns to the ways in which many indigenous peoples understand the beingness of animals within their legal systems. She draws on the work of several indigenous law profs and graduates at UVic Law. In these indigenous legal systems, we see four key differences with Western legal orders. First, legal orders are kin-centric, Nancy Turner's famous phrase, or animal-centric relationships, not anthropocentric. That is, their relationships with all our relatives, humans and more than humans. Secondly, all our animate relatives includes not only animals and human animals, but also all living beings, animals, trees, rivers, oceans, ecosystems, soils, rocks, and the living earth herself. Thirdly, legal systems are not imposed by humans over the earth, animals and human beings by coercion. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. The diverse networks of law or nomoi that govern animate life on earth already exist in practice. Interacting in accordance with them has co-sustained life for millions of years and recovered from previous mass extinctions by processes of symbiosis and symbiogenesis, that is, the creation of new forms of life. So on this anima-centric worldview, the role of humans isn't to make laws and impose them coercively over each other in the living earth as a kind of storehouse of natural resources and human resources to be extracted, commodified, used, and disposed. Rather, the role of law and governance is first to understand the norms and norm generation that already govern biodiversity symbiotically. And secondly, then, to design norms of law and governance that interact in co-sustaining ways with them. As John Burroughs, Val Napoleon, and Aaron Mills suggest, this is the way of law of governance of the indigenous peoples they work with. The Western legal life sciences have developed or perhaps rediscovered similar views of life systems themselves over the last century. As Lynn Margulis put it in 2012, quote, "The Gaia hypothesis is simply symbiosis on a planetary scale." The person I've found most helpful is the great systems theorist at Berkeley, Fritz Capra. And I have a long quote from him, excuse me, in the PDF that I attached, and you all have, those of you who are listening. But here's a short snippet from the long quote. This is how Capra puts it. The key to an operational definition of ecological sustainability is the realization that we don't need to invent sustainable human communities from scratch, but can model them after nature's ecosystems, which are sustainable communities of plants, animals, and microorganisms. Since the outstanding characteristic of the Earth household is the inherent ability to sustain life, sustainable communities and networks creatively evolve their patterns of living over time in continual interaction with other living systems, both human and non-human. End of quote. Very famous quote of his in 2002, and then developed in a series of books that followed from that. So this hypothesis of life-sustaining life on Earth is what I call animals become citizens of Gaia democracy and multi-species constitutionalism. I think it's right to say that Michael McGonigal introduced this eco-legal way of thinking to University of Victoria as early as the 1980s. You can see these features of Indigenous law and in the sculpture by Bill Reed, the great Haida carver, entitled The Spirit of Haida Gwaii, that accompanies this lecture. And maybe, Holly, I could ask you to share screen the sculpture of the Spirit of Haida Gwaii now. Wonderful, thank you. Can everyone see it? Yeah, good. Okay, so take a look at this very quickly. I just want to say this is a kind of symbol for me, or perhaps for the Northwest Coast, for this symbiotic way of life of humans and more than humans. The chief is standing in the canoe. He doesn't have a device of rule in the Western sense, that is a violence, force, or coercion. He or she is simply holding a talking stick. You can see it, he's standing it up like this. The chief doesn't speak. He or she simply passes the talking stick to each interdependent animal in the canoe. The paddlers then in turn speak freely and at length from their perspectives and modes of beingness, explaining the situation as they see it, suggesting how they think they should resolve the current disagreement, reconcile, and move forward. All the other passioners listen and try to put themselves in the mode of being of the speaker as much as possible. They then speak from their perspectives. The others listen and try to move around and see the situation from these perspectives in turn. These dialogues of reciprocal elucidation, as I call them, are seen as the exchange of the greatest gifts that humans and other animals can offer one another. That is, to move around and see the situation in which we live from the perspectives of all the interdependent and vulnerable members of our bioregion. Each member expresses their gratitude for the gift of the view of others and then reciprocates by presenting the gift of their perspective as clearly as possible. Thus, the dialogue generates what Indigenous people here on the coast and also across Turtle Island call gift, gratitude, reciprocity relationships among all the passengers. Gift, gratitude, reciprocity relationships really are the symbiotic relationships among all life forms that co-sustain life on Earth. By generating these GGR relationships, if I can call them that, in the canoe, they reconnect themselves with the larger gift, gratitude, reciprocity relationships that sustain all life on Earth. So this then exemplifies Gaia democracy and multi-species constitutionalism. These dialogues often begin with the exchange of gifts and condolence ceremonies, so we can get an example of gift, gratitude, reciprocity that we're familiar with. This, especially in the oral treaty tradition, starts with these kinds of gift ceremonies. This reminds the participants of the gift relationship that sustain life, and they've been somehow alienated from for some reason and are now working to reconnect and reconciliate through dialogue. Once these symbiotic relationships are generated through listening and storytelling, they provide the basis for working out a way forward. So although the passengers are clearly disagreeing and conflicting with each other in the canoe, it's important to notice finally that they take place within a broader horizon of intersubjective agreement in a symbiotic way of life that supports this surface disagreement and its resolution. This is indicated by the fact that they're in a stable cedar canoe and that they're paddling in unison despite the disagreements that they're having above the paddles that are in unison. And of course, the canoe itself, we realize, is held afloat by the symbiotic buoyancy of the ocean on which they depend. And of course, a long story about the cedar canoe itself and how the cedar forest sustains all life. So the spirit of Haida Gwaii is thus the life-sustaining gift, gratitude, reciprocity spirit that animates and co-sustains all life, anima mundi in Latin. Thus, the fourth feature of indigenous law, fourth and final feature, is that the humans subject to it work up their articulation of the law democratically through dialogues with each other, as in the canoe. So we can go off the shared screen now. Holly, thanks very much. So let's realize we have lots of examples of this going on the Northwest Coast. Traditional indigenous knowledge keepers and Western life scientists began to converge from their very different perspectives on this understanding of the relationships of co-sustainability of life on Earth after World War II, around 1948-49. The first successful encounter on the West Coast, really strikingly successful, was on Haida Gwaii in the 1980s in the Great Protests and then the co-management and governance agreements that followed. Then a decade later, the Clayoquot Sound protest, in which indigenous and non-indigenous people joined hands, and this led to negotiations of what was called the Clayoquot Sound Forest Practices Code and co-management agreements in the 1990s that worked out by Western scientists and traditional indigenous knowledge keepers in quite remarkable agreement. Then in the early 2000s, the Great Bear Rainforest agreements followed. Then, since the early 2000s, several land-back co-governance and co-management agreements are either in the courts or in governmental negotiations today at various stages, and several of them in practice. And here at the University of Victoria, the Indigenous Law and Common Law program, the Indigenous Law Research Unit, the Earth-Based Legal Pedagogy, POLIS, the Environmental Law Center, developed during the very same period. As Manisha shows, relational feminist scholars have been major contributors to these movements. There are now many practices of Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants working in diverse ways to free themselves from unsustainable social relationship and to cultivate sustainable symbiotic relationships in their bioregions. John Burroughs has a nice phrase for all these communities of practice that are taking place. He calls them meaning-making practices. Okay, so that's the good side of the story today. The question then is how to understand and extend these small local practices of working towards reconciliation with Mother Earth to a larger scale so that they become transformative of the dominant, competitive, antagonistic, and unsustainable social systems. This is the question, what's called ecosocial succession, from predominantly unsustainable to sustainable, strongly coupled ecosocial systems. So let's begin from the inside of Manisha's work that all animals are vulnerable. They are all animated by the complex relationships of animacy of the living earth. These relationships are often described as mutual aid, of mutuality, of sharing, of joining hands, and so on. In the life and earth sciences, the power of animacy is called anima mundi or symbiosis, symbiogenesis. In systems theories, its co-sustaining cycles are called virtuous cycles in both the ethical sense and the systemic sense that they sustain the interdependent members the reciprocal relationships among them, and the system as a whole, as a gestalt. However, these animate systems aren't hardwired or determinate. The members of them always have room to maneuver within them, Spielraum in the German. They are interdependent, not intradependent. They are relational and vulnerable in their indeterminate interactions. This is why learning the symbiotic ethos through practice is a necessary feature of sustaining life on Earth. To use the indigenous terminologies, animals have the vicious capacity to take all the gifts that are given to them by others, yet be ungrateful rather than grateful, to take advantage of the gift by using it and simply consuming it, and further, they can refuse to reciprocate. These relationships, these vicious relationships, are thus far from equilibrium, this vulnerability to tipping over from a virtuous cycle to a vicious cycle. So these symbiotic interactions are vicious in both the ethical and system sense. If these taking without reciprocating or taking advantage relationships become habitual and systemic, a virtuous cycle is succeeded by a vicious cycle. Members prey on their sustainability conditions without reciprocity, as we know all around us on the West Coast, destroying interdependent ways of life around them, and eventually destroying their own life conditions. This is referred to as extinction and collapse in the Western literature. In indigenous languages, it's called Wendigo or Wetigo. It's a monster that's oriented towards consuming, what Robert Davidson calls voraciousness. In European languages, these virtuous and vicious cycles are described in terms of anima and animus. Anima is feminine. It refers to the virtuous cycles in which members have mastered the ethos of symbiotic interaction. When there are disruptions and dispute, they have ways to conciliate their differences, adjust their regulatory relationships within the background constitutive virtuous relationships of the implicate order as a whole, and so carry on together. So the major cycle that sustains life is symbiotic, virtuous, conciliatory, and anima. So this, incidentally, the feminine anima, this is why Sir James Lovelock called his planetary symbiosis hypothesis the Gaia hypothesis. Gaia is the female goddess of Mother Earth. So let's look at these vicious social systems that we're up against. Vicious cycles of taking advantage, non-reciprocating, and exercising power over others rather than with them are called, in contrast, animus. Animus and its cognates are all masculine: animosity, enmity, adversity, and so on. So this is the masculine side of the vulnerable human condition. If we are to understand and transform the unsustainable, vicious social crisis and the climate and pollution crisis they're causing, we need to understand how these vicious cycles erupt within virtuous cycles, gradually become dominant, and lead eventually to societal collapse and ecological extinction. Given the room to maneuver within the interdependent relationships and the vulnerability of the members, vicious behavior, let's say animosity, can erupt in any relationship, as we all know. So let's examine the eruption of vicious interaction and counteraction in human relationships first. Pema Chödrön, I don't know if everybody here knows Pema Chödrön, but she's a practicing Buddhist in the Maritimes in Canada. She gives a famous description of how animosity erupts within animacy relationships in response to any kind of disturbance. It's called a charge, or set shenpa in Tibetan, that erupts when another person or event strikes you in the wrong way for some reason. Here's her quote. In Tibetan, there's a word that points to the familiar experience, and here's her statement that is at the root of all conflict, all cruelty, oppression, and greed. The usual translation is attachment, but this doesn't quite express adequately the full meaning. I think Shenpa as getting hooked or as a kind of charge. We humans have the good sense to usually catch this charge of angry energy when it arises, reconsider its causes, and conciliate and resolve the conflict non-violently with the other. However, when we get hooked, excuse me, by the emotional charge of anger, fear, and hatred, we separate ourselves from the anima relation with the other, who's taken to be the cause of the anger. We other the other. We take up an adversarial relationship and engage in standardly in three types of response: fighting the opponent, fleeing the situation, or submitting. The conflict is then resolved by the coercive imposition of power over relationships of various kinds: ruler-ruled, master-servant, civilized, primitive, employer-employee, and so on. These imposed master-subject relationships then become systemic. The people subject to these power over relations comply with them. They do not cooperate the relationships, as in the gift, gratitude, reciprocity relationships. Excuse me. That is, the relationship isn't under the shared authority of those who are subject to it having a say and a hand in shaping it. Rather, the subjects of master-servant relationships are constrained to compete with each other for comparative advantages of various kinds within these relationships: ranks, positions, grades, riches, power, fame, and so on, and all the comparative goods that we struggle for in our competitive societies. Moreover, many people subject to them resist, in turn, the form of subjection, respond by protest, resistance, and revolution that then impose new legal, political, economic, gender, and racial relationships of power over, and the vicious systems carry on, perhaps in a more escalated form. The unintended consequence of the development of these competitive social systems and the legal and political systems that regulate them is presumed to be, and at least in our Western understanding, economic growth. This competition drives economic development, the spread of democracy, equality, and we're always told world peace coming along in some future end of war to come in some future generation. This master-servant dialectic, as it's called, is actually endorsed in one way and another by the major theorists of both capitalist and anti-capitalist modernization and globalization, whether it's in the global north or the global south. This global assemblage of vicious systems is unsustainable and ultimately self-destructive, as we've known since the early 1950s. So since we're all subject to these vicious and unsustainable social systems, how do we work to free ourselves from the habitual charge of them and begin to reconnect with all our kin in mutually self-sustaining way? So one answer is to be the change by changing the habitual way we normally interact in the face of a disturbance. So to understand this kind of change, we can turn to kinesiology. The reason for this is that the phenomenological way in which we interact as diverse animal beings is, of course, primarily perceptual, not linguistic. This is the primary realm of the symbiotic ethos that Manisha pointed to in her account of the three features of relationality. It is the ecosocial kinesiology of relational and vulnerable embodied animals who are trying to find their way in relations in which they're entangled. So here's what kinesiology can tell us about how we can learn to constrain this disposition to turn vicious rather than virtuous when our vulnerability is in some way threatened. Excuse me. So our human nervous systems are life systems through which we perceive and interact with other members of the living earth. So we're looking now at the human living system. And these systems are composed of two distinct types of perceptual receptors. They are called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system, SNS, is the one that perceives disturbances as potential threats to our well-being. It tends to separate, as we've seen, us off from the cause of the disturbance, tries to protect us from it. It often triggers the emotion of anger, sometimes fear, other times hatred, depending on the perceived disturbance, and thus to orient us to responding by fighting, by fleeing, submitting in response to. So this is children's Shenpa. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system enables us to free ourselves from the sympathetic or othering response, to pause, to examine the disturbance and its causes, to consider the appropriate response with understanding and compassion, and to transform the energy of our initial anger into working with, rather than working against, the animate beings who cause the perturbation. Kinesiologists call the parasympathetic nervous system our sixth sense. It is the perceptual basis of Manisha's reciprocal symbiotic ethos that integrates and reintegrates us into symbiotic relationships. The problem today is the parasymbiotic nervous system is not paramount in many social relationships. The defensive, aggressive, submissive, sympathetic nervous system has become paramount in our subject formation in the competitive relationships of the paramount social systems we inhabit most of the time in our formal social systems. So fortunately, it's possible to reintegrate the two nervous systems so that the parasympathetic nervous system becomes paramount and reintegrates us into the interdependent life world. This process of reintegration is called by a term I find very hard to pronounce, but it's proprioception. Okay, so proprioception consists of a set of practices of the self and of the self with others. These include things like learning to balance stress, meditation, breath work, yoga, nutrition, exercise, and other kinesthesia exercises. It also includes such everyday practices as trying to perceive and be responsive to the living earth around us, to working with others, with plants and photosynthesis, with agriculture, with handicrafts, with weaving, canoeing, nature therapy, swimming, where you learn about buoyancy of the living ocean, and other practices of treating Gaia herself as both our university and our teacher. So these practices gradually reweave and reintegrate us back into the living earth so that animacy rather than animosity becomes our paramount orientation once again. So this is the great promise of the instrument of proprioception, which I associate very closely with Manisha's symbiotic ethos. So this kind of work on our own human life system is not only how individuals free themselves from captivity to the unsustainable vicious social systems, it's the way the living earth herself recovers from vicious cycles. And these processes of proprioception in other animals is called ecological and ecosocial succession, as in seceding. We secede from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle. And it's meant to replace, in this way of thinking about social change, reform and revolution. Mike Simpson, a wonderful former UVic student and now a geography prof in Scotland, gives us a marvelous example how ecological succession works. His example is a West Coast forest recovering from clear-cut logging. And the full quote is in the PDF I sent around. You can look at it. I won't read out the whole quote, but I will read out the main point of it. Here's what he says. Living systems do not only reproduce themselves by ecological succession, their very life processes nourish their habitat and strengthen the condition of life around them. They're not only biotic, but symbiotic with others. They thereby create an organism that's larger than themselves or their individual species. That's to say, they recreate the permaculture. The cycle of life, creating the condition of more life, continues as the forest gradually grows into a rich biodiverse ecosystem. This is called ecological succession. Living systems are not only self-generating, not auto-generating, but they are relational insofar as they build conditions of life around them, end of quote. So there's a symbiotic, not just biotic. Okay, so end of quote. Coast Salish people have known these features of ecological and ecosocial succession for centuries. When Nancy Turner held a workshop on regenerating plants, places, and people on the West Coast in 2019, the Kawakawak participants shared a famous dance with the participants. It's called Atlagima, the spirits of the forest. In the dance, a person or person becomes inhabited by greed and consumption, by Wendigo, or Wendigo the monster. They're full of animosity, competitive, aggressive, and greedy. The others don't counterattack, run away, or submit, or protest. Rather, they exercise their parasympathetic ethos of interacting mutually with all of their relatives around the Wendigo creature. As their gift, gratitude, reciprocity, permaculture grows, it gradually surrounds and transforms the Wendigo character and becomes paramount again, just as in ecological succession. So at the heart of these regeneration practices, self with other, are practices of listening to each other, as many ecologists have shown. These story sharing practices are primarily perceptual, as well as linguistic. They consist of embodied perceptual practices with all living beings in ways appropriate to their phenomenal modes of beingness. They are responsive to the behavior that speaks for itself of animals, plants, trees, and ecosystems that one experiences in Earth pedagogy. So, when people free themselves from subjection to vicious social systems and engage in practices of co-generating symbiotic permacultures of virtuous systems of freedom with all their relatives, they realize that this is manifestly a superior mode of being in the world with others. The animacy empowers them, buoys them up in the same way it does when you learn to swim or to paddle or to first walk. You reach a stage like jogging where you finally realize, wow, there's something now moving me, call it grace or different things in different spiritual traditions, but it's just us reconnecting with the animacy of all the life around us. But they also become aware, I think, once we engage in these communities of practice, of another feature of the vicious way of life that we're trying to leave behind. The vicious way of life presents itself over and over again as independent, as autonomous, as masterful, and as controlling. Yet from the perspective of interdependent being with way of life, it appears in the contrary as a predatory way of life, completely dependent on the virtuous life systems all around it that it exploits and eventually destroys. So the members of the virtuous systems have realized that various vicious social systems will now try to prey on the virtuous ecosocial and eco-legal systems that they're working to co-generate. For example, multinational corporations will accept UNDRIP and indigenous self-government, and then loan them hundreds of millions of dollars so they can buy shares in pipelines, LNG industries, natural resource companies, and so on. And First Nations become subject of these vicious systems by indebtedness and job creation, the main form of subjection in the contemporary age. This form of predation and subjection is similar, actually, to the way corporations were able to control the economic development of the third world countries by the imposition of constitutions and international trade agreements that opened their natural and human resources to free trade dominated by the corporations of the former colonial powers. Kwame Nkrumah called this neo-colonialism in the 1950s. And this kind of neo-colonialism carries on today in a somewhat similar way. So how should those of us who share this hypothesis of Gaia democracy and multi-species constitutionalism respond to this kind of neo-colonialism? So my own suggestion, just mine, is to consider following that at-legema way of ecosocial and ecological succession in practices of resurgence and reconciliation. And I just want to list the kind of features I think these practices of the symbiotic ethos have. The first feature of these practices is just non-cooperation with the vicious social systems as much as possible. People often overlook that first, non-cooperation, but historically, even in Western protest movements, that's been the primary step. See if you can't withdraw as much as possible from supporting the vicious social systems that are causing the crises. Second, these practices consist in generating and regenerating communities of practice and partnerships with other communities of practice that are themselves being the change in as many areas of life as possible. These can be exercised both apart from and sometimes even within dominant social, legal, and governmental systems and within educational systems. They involve participating in dialogue practices, interdependent partners that articulate and explore both the vicious and the virtuous relationships in which they themselves are entangled in their everyday lives and their workplace from their diverse subject positions and perspectives. They enact the spirit of Haida Gwaii in their everyday practices. The third feature of these practices is difficult dialogues that include histories of these relationships they're caught up in, both locally and more broadly: dispossession, genocide, inequality, racism, sexism, treaties and failed treaties, truth and reconciliation commissions, inquiries into missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women, self-government, land back, land sharing, Indigenous law negotiations and agreements, successes and failures, and especially ecosocial histories of the ecoregions they inhabit, among other relationships you take up in the course of these difficult dialogues. I think this is what our colleague Rai Moran means when he talks about truth before reconciliation. The fourth feature is, as participants pass the talking stick around in these meeting practices, the participants begin to co-generate a shared multi-perspectival and multi-species understanding of the world of entangled relationships in which they live and their places within them. These are places of relational interdependency and vulnerability and appropriate modes of symbiotic ethos of moving from vicious to virtuous. So these four critical practices gradually disclose, and here's the key, they gradually disclose to the participants grounded possibilities of practices of the freedom of thinking and acting differently with and for each other, here and now, in and on the explicated vicious and virtuous relationships they co-inhabit. That is, it shows the participants where and how they can exercise their symbiotic ethos effectively. Fifth and finally, fifth feature, they put these shared proposals, exposures, disclosures, practices of freedom to the experimental test of practice in communities of practice. Try them out, review them, learn from successes and failures, and begin a new cycle or a new wheel. They not only learn from each successive cycle, they acquire, here's the key thing, a kind of Amartya Sen point, but I think deeper than Amartya's view of capability generation. They acquire the corresponding intersubjective capabilities to work and evolve together with all their kin in virtuous co-sustaining ways. Slowly but surely, if all goes well, reaching tipping points within their ecosocial regions and moving forward towards larger ecosocial succession. This is, I think, how ecosocial succession mimics ecological succession and symbiogenesis. It involves the cultivation and exercise, excuse me, of the kinds of intersubjective symbiotic ethos appropriate to the ecosocial relationships in which we find ourselves. These wheels of symbiotic ethics or ethos take many different forms in different forms of practice. Now, some are sometimes mistakenly called Tully wheels around here, and so now I want to correct that. They should be called exemplary and liberating wheels of people like Val Napoleon, Hadley Friedland, Rebecca Johnson, Astrid Pinan, and so on, Judith Sayers, and many other students and community partners. It's these people who I have learned from how these 5 features of these practices develop as they've been exercising them in communities of practice throughout BC and Alberta and the North. I've learned from them. And most of this lecture comes out of thinking through the work that they've been doing since I ran across them in the early 1990s. I want to mention one feature, and I think this is a branch of practice that grows out of the, if I can call it, the permaculture of communities, virtuous communities of practice I was just talking about, which I'm calling these Val Napoleon wheels and cycles and Manisha ethos. And this is, I call contestation with. I think there's a form of civil disobedience and protest that grows out of these communities of practice that's quite distinct from different traditions we have of civil disobedience today. And I've been trying hard, as some of people listening, like Keith Cherry will know, been trying hard to get my head around this since things like Idle No More and so on. What kind of contestation practice goes along with it's grounded in a symbiotic ethos? So here's what I think. It can grow out of these communities of practice and their cycles of non-cooperation, decolonization, constructive communities, networks of practice. And I think it's important that it does grow out of those practices, because it's now those practices that are being recolonized by the predatory, vicious social systems that we're struggling to transform. So I call this symbiotic civil disobedience. This mode of contestation with others is as diverse as the biodiverse relationships in which it's enacted. So it's really difficult to generalize. Nevertheless, I think the basic idea is an attempt to compel, without coercing, a perceived opponent, somebody who strikes us as an opponent, to see the viciousness and predatory character of their habitual way of life, their animosity, if you like, by enacting symbiosis in the mode of contestation, in their face, so to speak. The aim is to show the superiority of the virtuous way of life and democratic partnership that you're offering to them by simply being the change. This can be effective because I think we animals learn by examples and by practice, not by rules and threats. This exemplary contestatory ethos can be shown in a kind of dramatic and compelling manner in 3 simple ways. The first is simply to point to all the resurgent communities of of ecosocial practice that are being generated and extended across Canada today, as well as their complex histories. That is, it shows the opponent that symbiotic relationships work in practice, that another world is not only possible, but is actual, as Boaventura de Sousa Santos puts it. The second way is to interact by enacting the symbiotic ethos of being with relatives in the relationship with the opponent. That is, the opponent is not treated like an opponent, an adversary, but is treated as if they're already a partner in a symbiotic relationship. They're not treated as an other, but as really a partner to become. This generates trust, and it also begins to weave the partner into being with conciliatory relationships of contestation and away from their antagonistic stance. Not easy to do. And the third dimension is that all a contestant is asking of the opponent or of the partner to be is to enter into genuine dialogues of possible reconciliation with all affected living beings, dialogue in which each shares the truth as they see it from their perspective and listens attentively to others in turn. So they're not imposing anything on the opponent. They're just saying, here's the talking stick. Let's talk about it honestly and truthfully. I think these exemplary modes of interaction are consistent with being the change and with ecosocial succession. I think it's quite similar to the way feminist suffragettes invented ethical jujitsu in the early 20th century, in which the practitioner enacts a kind of mutual caring mode of contestation vis-a-vis the opponent by taking care of themselves defensively, but also trying to get the opponent to come around to work together by having them, throwing them, using their own, the other's momentum and so on. Okay, so it's similar in some sense to ethical jujitsu. And I just see it as a way of trying to suggest and move the opponent to see, experience, and realize the more powerful animacy of a symbiotic ethos in contrast to their antagonistic ethos of othering. Okay. So in the Law Journal article that I mentioned at the very end of the PDF, I talk about some tools and seeds that are available in the common law that people are using today to try to move the common law around, to think about the role of law in the way we've been talking about here today, ecosocially, and in the kinds of hints we can take from Indigenous legal orders. So if people want more detail, they can look at that. I'll stop at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tully, for that amazing talk. We can open it up now to questions. So if you have a question, please write it in the chat. All right, we've got one question here. How different is this proposal from Vedana Shiva Earth Democracy and Kimlicka's proposal?
Thank you very much for that question. I preface all my answers by saying I am just one member of the Spirit of Haida Gwaii Canoe. I just have my own simple little West Coast perspective here. So I don't see what I've just said as a comprehensive viewpoint. I'm just saying, here's how the situation looks to me, and here's how I see some opportunities moving forward. To mention Vandana Shiva, I've been deeply influenced by Vandana Shiva's Earth Democracy. And I don't think there are many differences between what I was talking about today. She comes out of nuclear physics and then the Chipko movement in Northern India, and then working with some prominent contemporary Gandhians on techniques of satyagraha and so on. So she's miles ahead of me in many of these ways of thinking of these things. We invited her here to UVic and gave her an honorary doctorate. And she talked a lot about Earth democracy when she was here. And I found myself nodding my head almost 100% of the time. And I also, the Chipko movement in Northern India, tree hugging, I find fascinating, and its connections back to Gandhi's ashram. Miraben, who was a member of Gandhi's ashram, Sabarmati ashram in the late 1920s, and then Mira moved to the Chipko movement, and then Vandana Shiva came on board much more recently. And for those who don't know what the Earth Democracy is, a book, I think published around 1996. Now, turning now to Kim Licka's work, I'm not as familiar with it, his work on zoopolis and beyond zoopolis. And I see Will's work as a work in progress, if I can put it that way. I don't know if Abigail Eisenberg is listening in to this. She's a colleague of ours at University of Victoria, and she works closely with Will. And so he is moving along a spectrum that Manisha lays out in her work, in her book, on the beingness of animals and how we can recognize them. And I think she would be probably much better at comparing and contrasting Will's work with the the ideas I've thrown out at the moment. I think I've probably walked a little further into concentric worldview and view of the law than Kim has done, than Will Kim-Licka has done, but I haven't kept up with all of Will's work, so I'll defer to Will if he's listening in, or to Abigail as she is.
Thank you. We've got another question here that says, fascinating talk, given that you are talking about multi-species constitutionalism. I was wondering if you have any concrete proposals as to how constitutions would have to change.
Not at the moment. I'm too early on in thinking about that. The closest I came to actually making concrete proposals was a 2016 article in the journal Global Constitutionalism, and I just called it International Integral Global Constitutionalism, which was a multi-species my first attempt at thinking about multi-species constitutionalism. But it's very much a work in progress. And I'm a member of a network just called Multispecies Constitution, and we've broken it down into mitigation, adaptation, and transformation. But if I can go back to the law lecture, the McGill Law Lecture that I recommended, some of the things I say, some of the tools that are available in the common law that could move us around to being concentric in our legal reasoning are there as well. But again, these, Manisha, they haven't been worked out in any detail. If I will sit down and think about this question and maybe email you one in a day or two. But I think people in ecological law or eco-law are the people who have gone forward in this direction. And I also think if we look at what I call these three movements on the West Coast, the Haida-Gwaii Agreement, the Clayoquot Sound, the Great Bear Rainforest, and now what's going on today, you actually see people generating law out of working with environmentalists, lawyers, government officials, indigenous communities, we were out at the Sauk First Nation and we're talking to them. And all these ideas are being tried out in practice in very tentative ways. And some of us went up, it depends who's listening to this, with Chilcotin in northern BC, and we talked about their conversion to solar energy and the kind of laws they're developing around that. And there's no reason that they couldn't be models for common law thinking as well.
Great, thank you. We've got a number of folks who are just thanking you for your talk in the chat as well. We've got another comment here. Thank you, Jim, for this wonderful talk and paper. Can you say whether the symbiotic civil disobedience and ecosocial succession model is suitable for change in the private human family? And whether you agree that change in the private family is actually a great starting point for partnering change, because this is where vicious ways of living are first learned, including exploitation of labor in terms of gender and non-humans.
Who was that, Rod?
That was Manisha.
That was Manisha. Yes, I agree, totally. It begins in the family or in the daycare, I find. So yes to that, of course, it begins at the beginning. If you can start at a young age in the family or in daycare or in your sporting community, it's wonderful the way it can work. And thousands of young kids now go into various types of nature therapy, broadly defined. And we have groups of these that work through the schools now, as you know, in Victoria. And many of them are UVic grads that have come up through sociology or ecology, or maybe even some of them have done a degree in law or law and society. And they're taking these kids out and everyday ecological practices, getting to know Mother Earth and learning this, what I take is a kind of perceptual awareness. We all read David Abrams' book, From Becoming Human, and his work on how we can communicate with the trees and plants and the ocean and so on, and other living beings. And that's being taken into the schools, and the schools are probably in the Victoria area ahead of the university, if I can put it that way, or as advanced as the university, and at a very young age. And I think that's a revolutionary change. So I agree completely that it can take place in the family or in the early schooling or in all these nature therapy workshops.
Thank you. Another one here. Thank you for this talk. I'm wondering if you might be willing to say a little more about how democracy through dialogue can function equitably when certain members, i.e. humans, have much louder voices. How do we effectively participate in just democracy with those whose voices we struggle to hear or understand?
Yeah, I mean, there's two categories there. The whole disabilities literature helps us in how you understand humans that aren't abled in the way others are. But when we turn to non-humans, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's a really tricky one and it's difficult. And again, taking the example of some Indigenous nations on the Northwest Coast, if you look in the Black Canoe and you look at the passengers there's only one human. It's the ancient reluctant conscript they can see on the right-hand side of the canoe. All the rest are animals that are doing they're passing the talking stick to. And what Bill Reed's getting at there, the Haida artist, and this is true of the models he used, the late 19th century Argillite canoes that he used as a model for the spirit of Haida Gwaii, is in many Indigenous communities, your clan is an animal. It's a muskrat or it's a beaver. Well, not a beaver on Haida Gwaii, but a muskrat. Or so what when it's your turn to speak, I mean, this is a really important point, is Robin Wall Kimmener's point too on the East Coast. When you speak and your clan is muskrat or the bear clan, you know about bears and muskrats. You know about some part of the living earth. So when you get to speak, you're not speaking as a human, you're speaking about what you know, what sustains the salmon or the muskrat or the bear. So there are all these practices, and quite often what happens is the speaker doesn't do much actual talking. They put a mask on of the clan name, the bear or whatever, or the raven, and they do a dance that is saying, we have to listen to this. And this is what I've learned from years of working in this bioregion and paying particular attention to the sustainability condition of the salmon or the herring. This is what I would say about what they need to be sustainable. So a lot of the actual dialogue is not people going on about what they need. It's people saying, well, I have a duty to speak here because for 20 years I've been taking care of braiding or weaving or fishing or all these activities that link us intersubjectively to the living earth around us. And here I'm speaking just as a member of that community. And here are our sustainability conditions. So I think when you have to be careful when you're looking at the potlatch or a community meeting where they're trying to work out some difficulties, should we accept this LNG pipeline or not? When a traditional person gets up, they're not speaking for themselves. They're speaking for what they know from practical experience in their area of the ecoregion in which they live, which can be the animals, or it can be the soil, or it can be how the beavers keep the rivers flowing, and all sorts of ecological conditions that are the conditions of our life, and we're just completely unaware of them. So Suzanne Simard's book on learning to understand the mother tree and forests on the West Coast, very similar to that in BC, that we have to learn how to listen to that forest or whatever, and then learn how to present it in a dialogue and be the person who says it without getting person-centric, if you see what I mean. I think that's a fine art and a difficult one. I don't know if that was very clear. I'm having trouble, as you can tell, articulating it myself.
Thank you. We've got another one here. Wonderful talk. As you said, the key is whether the processes of exchange and deliberation really can turn up opportunities for arriving at consensus mutually acceptable. At planetary scale, can we really hope for chat just moved on me. At planetary scale, can we really hope for unanimity of perceptions and preferences sufficient to support agreement action? There are many First Nations keen to buy into the investments in resource development that might otherwise be seen as new colonial initiatives.
Yes, yeah, that's one of the questions. I think a very partial answer is we begin at the local, but also I don't think we're looking for unanimity. What I think we're looking for is trustworthy practices that everybody feels comfortable speaking in, from the local to the planetary. When people reach agreement, it's not that everybody agrees and they have unanimity. It's let's try this one out in practice. It's all, I didn't make that clear enough in this talk, and I think it's absolutely fundamental, and it's just the distinction between practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge. in theory and theorists, they're keen on unanimity. In practice-based activities, in real-life practical knowledge, from Aristotle to the present, you work together on things, you reach a kind of agreement in the sense, okay, it seems reasonable, I'm not 100% sure, but let's try it out. You put it into practice, you test it out, you look at it, say, whoa, that worked very well here, but it didn't do so well there. Somebody says, boy, it didn't work over here on the salmon side of things, or whatever it is on life support for such and such. We've got to start again. And you kickstart the wheel again, or the cycle again. You go back to the dialogue and say, okay, we can improve it. This is the practical view of human evolution, that we're never masters, we're always apprentices. I just think that's so fundamental to, if we're going to survive this sixth mass extinction. We're not looking for unanimity. We're looking for a system where we try things out, we get as many voices in as possible, we then try it out, but it's always open to contestation and renegotiation when we see it's not working well. So we never go, oh, we've got a virtuous cycle and it's self-sustaining, because that's never true. The idea that there's something called mastery is again on the animus. The master is on the male side of things here. We're always already apprentice, and we're always learning from our mistakes. And I think the latest work coming out of MIT on evolution, if I may say, is very much driving this home, that every other species has never stopped and said, we've got it. This is how we sustain ourselves. They're always trying, seeing some good things, but also seeing some problems, rethinking it and starting again. That's why it's called the wheel or cycle, because it's never ending. We've got to get that view of evolution. One of the problems with modernization and globalization is we think we have the model and we have to defend it against all comers. And that's a huge mistake that we're finding out.
Thank you. I think we've got probably time for one more question. Thinking of Latour, do you think it is problematic to rely on anthropocentric worldviews, Indigenous, Western, or otherwise, to resolve the issues we face today that seems to require a completely new way forward? It seems the current discussion is stuck at the modern frontier.
Well, I agree. Is this Bruno Latour we're talking about? Yes. I agree that many people are stuck at that modernization or globalization as the right answer. But I don't know what he means when, yes, I don't think it needs to be a wholly new. I think we can learn from our ancestors and the good ways that worked, put them together. Of course, we want to create new ways and be creative in the way we think through these things. But we can learn a lot from, for example, Indigenous cultures, from traditional, not technically Indigenous cultures, and many. What has surprised me, maybe it's because I came out of the natural sciences before I switched over into the human sciences, that since World War II, there's been this revolution in the Western natural sciences, in the life sciences and earth sciences. And it's an astonishing fact that these sciences have just turned themselves over. What you learned in university in the 1950s, I wasn't in university then, but my father went through that transition. He's an oceanographer. And by the 60s, people were bringing this cyclical view and sustainability view. Rachel Carson wrote in the early 60s, these were new ways of thinking. Earth Day came around 1971. Barry Commoner wrote his classic text in 1972. The Brundtland Commission, mid-70s, and so on. That's a whole new way of thinking And Foucault's point is it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of people rethinking these Western traditions and seeing what was wrong with them. So I don't think it's something new coming out of the blue. And another dialogue partner here is spiritual traditions. I referred to Pema Chodron because engaged Buddhists are teaching us how to do this. Engaged in practices are very important. In the Hindu tradition, you see practices that Neo-Gandhians draw on and so on. And so there are rich knowledge traditions on this little planet that are not all completely wrong, if you see what I mean. And we can draw on them as well as be creating these new ways of thinking out of them. So it's a way of continuity and creativity, putting them together. Hope that helps.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry to those that we didn't get to. There were some great questions lined up. But a good note to end on, I think, is somebody commented that your work holds hope. So a good way to end the conversation there. So thank you so much, Dr. Tully, and also to the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights, Law and Policy for funding this lecture series. Thank you again to our co-presenters at the University of Victoria, the Indigenous Law Research Unit, the Center for Global Studies, the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, and the Departments of Philosophy and Political Science. This lecture concludes the current year's ASRI Distinguished Lecture Series. If you can join us in person next month, we're very much looking forward to Justin Marceau presenting in person the third annual lecture in Animal Rights, Law and Policy here at the University of Victoria. His lecture is titled Carceral Logics and Animal Law, presented through the Faculty of Law. Justin Marceau is professor in the Sturm College of Law, University of Denver, and is also the Brooks Institute Faculty Research Scholar of Animal Law and Policy. If you'd like to stay up to date on all coming events and news, and you're not already on our monthly newsletter list, just please email Holly at the link provided at the top of the program. That's all for today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your day, and happy Valentine's Day as well.